It's probably the most relevant in terms of the podcast topic that we've done in a while.
It definitely had a lot of kind of anthropology.
They said the word Pleistocene in it.
Welcome to Screens of the Stone Age, the podcast where scientists review movies about prehistoric people. My name is Josh Lindell. I'm a grad student studying Neanderthal teeth, and I'm here with...
I'm Kimberly Plump. I am a bioarchaeologist. I study the human skeleton, health and disease, and human evolution.
And I'm Ross Barnett, a paleogeneticist, mainly looking at Ice Age megafauna.
And today we're talking about the movie Skullduggery from 1970. I can see you guys already rolling your eyes. Sometimes we just have a list of movies that I've been slowly compiling and just keep adding to, and every once in a while it's like, let's choose an older movie that none of us have ever heard of, I assume.
This one might be one of the more offensive ones we've ever watched, though.
This was a wild movie, and like we never worry about spoiling the movies because we're going to talk about the whole thing and the ending, and we're going to talk about, it's a 50-year-old movie, but this is the first time I really feel compelled to tell the viewers that if you haven't seen this movie, which none of them have because nobody's ever seen this movie, stop the podcast and go watch this movie for free on YouTube, because it's an experience, and I'm glad I was able to have this experience. But you can't have the experience if we talk about this whole movie first, because it's pretty remarkable. So who wants to summarize this movie?
I don't even know if I can, because for a lot of it, I was like, I don't know where this is going or what's happening. So maybe Ross is better to do it.
Ooh, well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's like about 6 different movies in one. It's it's very, very difficult to summarize. I could try, but
well, you could start it off, and I can try.
Yeah, I'm guaranteed to kind of trail off just because so much happens.
But also, nothing happens, too.
I can start by reading out the summary I sent you guys in our email suggesting this one.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
It says, Burt Reynolds discovers a missing link in Papua New Guinea and puts them to work in his mine, ? And then for some reason, the third act becomes a courtroom drama featuring the Black Panthers, ? And that's what I knew going into it.
All true. All that happens. Yeah. That's crazy. Yep. So... yeah, it's a Burt Reynolds film. I mean, I've not seen many films with Burt Reynolds in it, but it's weird. Anyway, so it starts in Papua New Guinea in 1970. It has a very 70s soundtrack, which is apparent straight away. And we first meet Burt Reynolds' character, who's Douglas, who's a mechanic working on an airfield. And a female anthropologist arrives. This is Sybil, played by Susan Clark.
They made sure to say female anthropologist.
Yes, that's very important to yes. How the plot develops. And she is on her way to an expedition in interior Papua New Guinea, and this intrigues Burt Reynolds and his friend Professor Krebs, who's also, working as a mechanic, despite being a professor of anthropology himself. That didn't make sense. Moving on. So this female anthropologist intrigues Burt Reynolds, so he tries to kind of tag along with her. He succeeds in doing this by basically sabotaging her original kind of guide, a guy called Swafford, who's played by Edward Fox. And he pisses off Burt Reynolds by condescending to him, I think. So they set a trap for him at night, which ends up breaking his legs, an arm, and various other things. So he can't go on the expedition, and Krebs and Douglas have to go instead. They help with the kind of organizing of the expedition. They organize canoes, which take them to where they want to go. Burt Reynolds' character Douglas makes no disguise of the fact that he's a total lech, and is leching over Sybil, Susan Clark's character, the whole time. They go to the village where they're supposed to be. They've also brought along a vicar for some reason, and a local police sergeant. The kind of base village that they're going to, they get to, it looks like it's abandoned, but actually there are people around, and they get invited to the spirit house, but they didn't know, or they didn't care that entry to the spirit house was taboo for women, and Susan Clark's character goes in as well, and sort of disguised slightly, and it's only later on that she's found to be a woman, and this leads to some issues that have to be amended for. Everything seems to go to plan. They get all the kind of supplies and manpower they need to carry on with their expedition from the base village. And so they set off the next day. They pass a crashed airplane in the kind of jungle route they're trekking, which they're able to surmise is from a cargo cult, which is briefly explained if people didn't know that already. They see a random warning sign, Tambu, which I guess is the Papua New Guinean kind of pan-Polynesian version of taboo, which says they're not allowed to go that way. Burt Reynolds shows all the classic cultural sensitivity of a 1970s man by pulling out the spear and chucking it away and telling them that they need to go on anyway. And so they walk a bit more forward, and then the native police sergeant that they've taken along with them suddenly gets speared in the stomach and falls off a cliff to his death. And then everyone stands around doing not much of anything for about 5 minutes.
It's not a big deal. They're like,
not a big deal that somebody's just been killed right in front of them by a spear that's come from nowhere. They don't even take cover, but they decide that they eventually, after 5 minutes of milling around, that they need to go a different way. They go a different way, and I think at that point, Burt Reynolds, who's called Douglas, and Professor Krebs, his pal, their ulterior motive is to find outcrops of phosphorus, which is in high demand for color TVs apparently, and they know that there are kind of some outcrops of it near where the anthropological expedition that Susan Clark's character is on is supposed to be going. So while they've kind of taken the alternative route, Krebs and Douglas go off to find some phosphorus, which they do, and their plan is originally to plant some like just recent bones to take back to Susan Clark and say, we need to hang around here and do more excavation because we found these bones, and they'll use that time to collect as much phosphorus ore as they can to sell for thousands of dollars. But actually, while they're exploring, they find the phosphorus, but they also find some real fossils, like a fossil skull just lying on the surface, which they take back, along with their fake fossils, to Susan Clark, and they show it to her, and she immediately twigs that the fake fossils that Douglas and Krebs show her are fake. But the skull that was actually a real fossil that was found by Burt Reynolds, she measures like one cranial dimension with her calipers, and then she brings out another skull which she has in her backpack to compare it to, and says that this is the missing link. That it's she reels off a whole bunch of sort of semi-scientific sounding hominid names and comes to her conclusion, and so she's quite happy about that and sends Douglas and Krebs off to find some more, which is fine by them. So they're off looking for more phosphorus. They think they're going to be millionaires given the amount that they found, but they also find another skull, which then Burt Reynolds takes back to Susan Clark, and she gets really annoyed because yes, it's the missing link skull, but it's not a fossil. It's like a recent skull, and this is obviously a fake. But then at that point, they notice there's actually some real surviving, living missing link people just where they are, and so that's why it was recent, because they're still around. And we see these people who get the name of the trophies. They're kind of semi-upright. They've got lots of orange hair. They're very short. They don't have a kind of articulate language as we know it, but they have like a kind of vocal symbolism like chimps have, with like hoots and pants and grunts and things like that. And immediately they get Susan Clark's character gives them the name of Paranthropus erectus grammaeus. So that's obviously named after herself, which is a big no-no in taxonomic circles. You can't really do that. They kind of
one of the three things wrong with that name.
Yeah. Yes, there's many things wrong with it. But anyway, so they kind of set up camp to try and get closer to these tropies because they're very shy and they don't come out. Krebs has the most success. He has about 1,000 sandwiches in his rucksack, and they respond well to ham sandwiches and kind of come out. And he becomes friends with one called Topasia, who's a female, and kind of treats her as a sort of pet, despite the fact that she looks very human, because she is a human with some fake fur glued all over. What else? They're very partial to spam as well, like tinned ham. Burt Reynolds feeds them some spam. He shows them how to open the tin, like the 70s demigod that he is. I think I've glossed over the fact that one sultry evening, Sybil, the anthropologist, and Douglas have a steamy 70s liaison in their tent, which sets up the kind of doomed romantic love angle that's there in the background. Right, what's going on? Oh yeah, so apparently the funder of Susan's expedition is a guy called Van Cruysen, who's like a millionaire mining and other profit-driven companies kind of guy. We're not meant to like him. But like the very next day after Douglas and Sybil have had their tryst, Douglas accuses Sybil of kind of using Van Cruysen as a sugar daddy to pay for her expedition, and that Douglas was just like a way to pass the time, yada yada. At the same time, we notice that Krebs has his trophy, who he's named Topasia, in his tent with him, which is also pretty freaky and sets things up for later on. I think Sybil sends, or somehow they have to get the fossils and the film that they've taken of the trophies back to Van Cruysen to encourage him to produce further funding for their study. I can't remember, is it Sybil that goes back to get Van Cruysen, or is it...
No, she sends it with Redford and the guy, because they were worried that they weren't actually going to deliver it. But
right.
They did.
Okay, so sends it with Burt Reynolds.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's like a big cut scene where they come back to the site, and we're not sure how much time has passed, but basically Burt Reynolds has set up a phosphorus mine using the trophies as slave labor. Well, not slave labor, but forced labor, where they get paid in tins of spam for each kind of cartload of phosphorus.
And she set up a whole like scientific lab observatory thing with them too, so it must be years of past, I would assume.
Yeah, basically like a sort of a stud farm for trophies. She's trying to encourage them to breed, which they seem to have had no problem doing in the wild anyway.
Her main aim is to try and show whether they're animal or human.
Yeah,
that's the main question.
Which seems bizarre from kind of our modern viewpoint. But yeah, so she's working on them as a scientific subject. Douglas, that's Burt Reynolds, is using them as a labor force for his phosphorus mine. It's apparent that however much time has passed, Van Cruysen and Sybil are an item now. They seem to be together. The question of whether the trophies are animal or human comes up all the time. Pops, who's the kind of vicar that they brought along, has doubts about whether they're human or not. He at one point is about to baptize them, but then decides against it.
That's because Van Cruysen put the idea in his mind that it would be blasphemy if he were to baptize an animal. And Van Cruysen has his own ulterior motives because he wants to set up the breeding program because then he can have an infinite source of slave labor, because if they're not human, then there's no law against enslaving them.
Yeah. And there's an interesting discussion where they are at the kind of crux of this question: are trophies animal or human? And they talk about using the biological species concept to test whether they're human or not, with the idea that...
This is where it got creepy.
Oh, yeah. Totally. So the biological species concept being that any two populations are part of the same species if they can interbreed freely and produce fertile offspring. So if trophies and humans can breed together to produce fertile children, then they must be the same species. If they produce infertile or are incapable of producing offspring together, then they must be separate species. I mean, there's thousands of different species concepts in biology because biology is not a kind of neat and tidy subject. And this is the most, I think they've jumped straight to the most problematic one possible in which to try and decide the basis of whether the tropes are species or not. Anyway,
but it is the most popular one.
It's the most
biology.
It's the most well known for sure. But yeah, no one's gonna use that concept for the discussion of whether humans and chimps are separate species. That's not something that happens in the kind of anthropological or paleoanthropological work. Anyway,
but when they realize it, they were like, "Why haven't we done this before? Of course, this will solve the problem."
Yeah. Though at that point, Krebs is looking very sheepish in the background, I noticed, which is important later on, I think. Anyway, so it turns out it's Sybil's birthday, and they're having a big party with the kind of native Papuans. Have invited them to a big feast, which they go over to. Sybil says it would be great to see this, and they're having like a kind of massive open fire barbecue, discussing various issues, and then all of a sudden, Burt Reynolds realizes that the main course of their birthday barbecue is tropy, that the Papuans are eating the tropy, these missing link anthropoids are on the menu, and he gets outraged. He's become somewhat, despite having used them as forced labor in his mind, he seems to have some kind of sympathy for them and has feelings for them as humans, as people that should be protected rather than exploited. And so he's outraged that they're being eaten. But the people that are in charge of cooking say, it's okay, these are wild tropes, these aren't the ones from the mine. There's not a problem here. But it's trouble. And while they kind of storm away disgusted, Krebs is looking for Topasia, his kind of female pet trophy, and they discover that she's in the helicopter. It had been said earlier that she's fascinated by helicopters. Somehow she's got into their helicopter and is trying to take off in it, despite not having the capability to pass her pilot's license. And so she gets into trouble. Burt Reynolds very bravely kind of wrestles down the helicopter and gets her out. But she's not very well. Something's wrong with her. They need to get her to Sydney. Burt Reynolds says that she's looking a bit fat, that she's not doing very well, that what they should do is she should take the trophy to Sydney, show it to the press, tell them what's going on. Why don't they just say that she's pregnant and that they need to find who the father is, and that this will encourage the press to take an interest in their story. All the meantime, Krebs is looking very, very sheepish in the helicopter passenger seat while they're talking about this. And eventually they twig, or Burt Reynolds twigs, that, yeah, Topasia is actually pregnant, and yeah, Krebs is the father of this interspecific hybrid, which is nuts. They try to get her to a hospital. They arrive at the kind of base site where they'd been employed as mechanics in Papua New Guinea. They don't have enough time, they figure, to get her to Australia, so they just go to a motel in somewhere in Papua that has a Snow White theme for unknown reasons, and put Topasia in there and call for a doctor. And the doctor comes. They show him in the dark what's been going on. Topasia has given birth, but the baby is dead. And so Burt Reynolds, under a bit of time pressure, forces the doctor to fill in a death certificate for the baby, to put Krebs as the father, and Topasia Gramensis as the mother. And just as he's signed the death certificate, Van Kruysen and Sybil and Pops, the vicar, turn up and kind of dramatically take the doctor back into the room where Topasia is and show that she's not human, that she is a trophy or a monkey, as the doctor says. And then, out of nowhere, Burt Reynolds says, "I confess to the murder of Topasia's son." So,
out of nowhere.
And then, suddenly...
But that was his plan all along, wasn't it?
Was it?
Well, you wouldn't have known the baby was going to die.
Yeah. What if the baby had been born alive and had been fine?
I don't know. I just assumed that they were expecting it to be stillborn because obviously the whole question of whether or not they were human, where like the scientist in the end says, I can't answer that question because there's somewhere in between, right? Mm-hmm. And just from the biological species concept, I was expecting, well, if there's somewhere in between, then, you know, it's not a yes or no, are they interfertile? There's a gradation where at some point you start to have problems, and you can conceive, but the offspring's going to have problems. So I was kind of expecting it was going to be stillborn.
But I mean, when she's originally
maybe I'm giving it too much credit.
I think possibly. But when she's originally doing her, one-dimensional classification of the skull, doesn't she say it's kind of somewhere between human and Neanderthal? She mentions Neanderthals anyway, and we know that
in the court case or earlier.
No, when she's out
earlier
in the
court
field,
case was just all over the place.
When she first finds the skull and measures it, and is able to work out and give it a scientific name. So we know now, and it had been suggested even back then that humans and Neanderthals would have been interfertile. So I think that's possibly giving it too much credit to suggest that they would have thought that it would have been stillborn.
Based on everything else, it's giving them far too much credit. But also, so he says, I killed the baby, which then means that he gets charged with it and then has to go to trial. And then the main cusp of the trial is to prove whether the baby was human or not. Because if the baby is human, then he goes to jail. And if the baby's not human, then he doesn't go to jail. But he wants the baby to be human. So why does he have to go to jail? Like, why can't... I don't know. That just seems like something people would want to answer regardless of whether he goes to jail or not. It just didn't make sense.
I thought this part was brilliant, and maybe he was just thinking quick on his feet. But biology can't answer the question of whether or not something's human for exactly this reason. There's a gradation, right? Human is an arbitrary distinction that we made up. We're just really lucky that there's only one human species today, and it makes it really easy to say what's human and not. But the question of when something becomes human in evolution, I think, is a really interesting question that people don't really talk about that question as much as I want, because it's really interesting. But but
he's put his life on the line for it.
But that's the thing, because he had a change of heart. He started off, he's like, I can just use them to mine my phosphorus. But then throughout, he's getting this inkling, like when Pop says they laugh, he's like, they laugh. And he just sort of thinks about that. And so he's like realizing over time, you know what, they really are human. And he realizes what's at stake is that if they're not human, they're going to be enslaved, and he has become fond of them. He doesn't want that to happen. So he sacrifices himself because he knows biology can't answer the question, but the law can answer the question. So if he goes to jail for it, that means they can't be enslaved. And I thought that was a really brilliant, I mean, apart from everything wrong with the movie, I thought that was a really interesting way to answer this question, because biology can't answer the question, but the law can do it.
I guess I missed the whole that he didn't want them to be enslaved thing, because he was the person that...
Well, he never really... Yeah, he was enslaving them. At some point, the other guy, he's like, that's slavery, when he talks about Van Croizen's plan. Van Croizen's like, how is that any different from what you're doing? So he kind of went through that growth arc off screen, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, definitely it's interesting that the kind of final act sort of switches from, I don't know what it is, but it becomes like a courtroom drama.
I know, we're not even done yet. We still got like 20 minutes left of the movie here.
Yeah, but they it's like so many different things all at once. And so the court case is, are the trophies human or are they animal? Is Burt Reynolds guilty of murder, or is he guilty of nothing worse than animal cruelty? And there's a whole bunch of quite interestingly done kind of legal back and forth. There's the kind of the Susan Clark character, Sybil, the anthropologist, brings out a whole bunch of skulls and claims this one's a chimp, this one's a Neanderthal, this one's a trophy, this one's a human.
Terrible.
Totally terrible. And they're not even, the one that she says is a chimp skull is very clearly a human skull.
Yeah, they're all
human.
She makes it as if it goes. She's like baboon to chimpanzee to Neanderthal to, I forget what she said, a modern human, some group, and then the top would be the male white lawyer. Like, she was doing the terrible racist.
Well, I don't think she was doing it. They got the defense get in like this terrible caricature of like an evil racist professor who was born in Rhodesia, which kind of gives you a clue as to what he's going to be like. But his argument is that definitely that the trophies aren't human. That you have, what was his let me just get back to the bit of page where, he talks about the evolutionary ladder. He's supposed to be president of the International Council for Zoology or something. Apparently, there's 754 traits that define a man. He gets asked, "Are pygmies men?" And he sort of begrudgingly says that yes, they are. But then he has this very racist kind of classification where you have, intermediate grades between white men at the top and everything else kind of below that, and it's kind of fairly horrible, but reflects, historical thinking from back in the 19th century, which has taken too long to kind of die out. But yeah, so there's some interesting back and forths. I like the bit where they kind of put Pops, the vicar, on the stand, who's a polyglot, and they give him lots of questions about language, as to whether the Tropes have language. He's learnt their language, which is like various kind of hollers and grunts and shouts, which are for things like danger or where's my mate or things like that. And he thinks that the Tropes speak, which is kind of a powerful argument in favor of their humanity. So Burt Reynolds is in jail. Susan Clark visits him in jail with some champagne and some food in a picnic basket. I don't know why, but they kind of have back and forth a bit. He asks her what she's going to say when she's on the stand as to whether Tropes are human or animals. She says she's going to say that they're human, and he's, I think, happy about that. But then, out of nowhere again, he kind of says, "I didn't kill the baby; he was born dead."
I know, and so nobody's actually looked at the baby. No medical examiner or doctor has actually looked at the baby.
Yeah, and then they have a kind of clinch there as well, because she obviously believes him because he's Burt Reynolds, for God's sake. And then the kind of final bit of the court case, they bring Tupasia in. She's obviously hugely traumatized from having given birth to a stillborn child. They've kind of given her a rag doll as a substitute, but they take her in like a bamboo cage and have her as essentially evidence in the trial. And they, from out of nowhere, the black humanists turn up, who are obviously modeled on Black Panthers, and they have some of the best lines in the film. One of them says, "There's been a lot of horseshit said down here in Nowheresville," which I thought was fantastic. But they have a valid point that there's this discussion about what it is to be human, whether you can measure it, whether it's something that's a kind of metric trait of your skull, which is a very dangerous route to go down, one that we know from study of history is a dangerous route to go down. And so it is kind of quite interesting. How did these individuals from a purely American political group get all the way to Papua New Guinea in the space of a trial in the 70s? Who knows? We'll just gloss over that. But they have their own agenda, which is fair enough. They kind of say that they want to show that the Tropes are not human, but they're kind of semi-human animals, but they're actually they're related to Caucasians rather than have anything to do with the kind of African diaspora. So, that's a whole other kind of can of worms as well. But while they're arguing about this, I'm getting kind of quite agitated. Tupasia escapes out of her bamboo cage, climbs all over the courtroom, including up some very poorly restrained bookshelves, which she then collapses on top of herself and dies. So that's terrible. Krebs is hugely upset. It's been fairly definitively proven that he and Tupasia were more than just friends, and he kind of looks very sad as he takes her little rag doll and drops it into the ocean. And then the trial ends, basically, with the judge deciding that he doesn't know how to decide what is human, but that Burt Reynolds is not guilty anyway. And that's it. And then you're just sort of sitting there going, what the fuck? It was like 1 hour and 45 minutes of just, what? And then you just have to, you can split your life into two halves before you watch this film and after.
Yes.
It's that nuts.
Yep.
Also, just kind of an aside, you could probably cut it down to an hour and a half if you edited out all the montages of topless canoe paddlers.
Yes.
This is on, we watch this on YouTube, by the way. It's interesting when you find something with nudity still up on YouTube, but maybe it'll get taken down eventually. I don't know how much we want to say about
what they got wrong.
all the black nudity, the black topless women, which felt very exploitative to me because you don't have white topless women in this movie.
No, Susan Clark remains defiantly clothed all the way through.
She does have a bikini at one point. And Burt Reynolds immediately tries
topless.
to cover her up with a towel.
Yeah, Burt Reynolds is topless.
Because he doesn't like the other man looking at her.
Yeah.
Okay, we're already a half an hour into this recording, so...
it's just very weird film.
Very weird, very sexist, very racist, very, very scientifically inaccurate. But, like, I know it was made in the 70s, but it was even a lot for that.
Yeah, but I think they were definitely trying to do something. It's one of those films where they're trying to make a point, but as the viewer, you come away not realizing what point it was they were trying to make because they've just kind of ballsed it up that much. I think their kind of intentions were good. I think their kind of wider point that they were trying to make was that, we are all humans. If we have kind of tropes as an outgroup, this is, something that comes often quite a lot in phylogenetic analysis, something which I have a little bit of background in, is that if you're struggling to resolve your phylogeny and figure out, what are your in-groups, what are your out-groups, then one of the best ways to do that is to introduce a known out-group that can root your phylogeny and provide a kind of known side branch. So this is the kind of role that the tropes play in this film, is that if you know what your closest relative outside your in-group is, then that makes your in-group as a whole much more coherent. And with the idea that, knowing that the tropes are there and that they're a kind of side branch of the human species, then that makes the humans that are the rest of us kind of much more connected to each other. I think that's what they were trying to go for, but just in a very kind of ham-fisted 70s way.
So there's a lot of science-y words in this movie, and I think they're probably all entirely wrong. I don't think they got any facts right at all in this movie.
No.
Starting with the tagline, I don't know if you read this on the movie poster. Was it human, animal, or the living descendant of the missing link?
Right.
So the living descendant of the missing link is us. That's what makes it a link.
Yeah.
And also humans are animals. So yes, it was human. Yes, it was animal. No, it's not a descendant of the missing link because the ancestor is the missing link, not the descendant.
And there is no such thing as missing link.
Exactly.
And there's no such thing as a missing link.
Yeah.
So that
the names that they come up with are all a bit of a mishmash. Homo pekinensis. That's not a thing. Tuberculum geniale.
Did she say Homo pekinensis or Pithecanthropus? I wrote Pithecanthropus pekinensis. They say Pekinesis.
Yeah.
They did say Paranthropus, though, right? And that's a real...
Oh, yeah, and they said Synanthropus, too. So let's disentangle this, because taxonomic nomenclature is one of my favorite things to talk about, and it's... everybody loves taxonomic nomenclature, right? So, when he first gives her the fake bone, she identifies it as the tuberculum geniale of Pithecanthropus pekinesis. We'll come back to tuberculum geniale. Let's not forget about that. So Pithecanthropus is an old name for what we now classify as Homo erectus, and Pekinensis, they say Pekinesis, but Pekinensis is also a species name for Homo erectus, but Pithecanthropus pekinensis, as far as I know, was never a name, because the early Homo erectus found in China at Zhukudian was named Synanthropus pekinensis. And the early Homo erectus found from Java by Eugene Dubois in 1891, he called Pithecanthropus erectus. And then there was also other fossils later from Java named Meganthropus paleojavanicus. And so this is in the early days of paleoanthropology when nobody had any idea what stuff was. And every time you found something new, you gave it a new name. Eventually, those names became out of control. And so they revised this in the 20th century. I think it was Ernst Mayr, if I'm not mistaken, that did this revision and decided that all these things, all these different species names, they actually are a type of human, so therefore they belong to the genus Homo. And because of, I think we've mentioned the principle of priority in the naming conventions, which means the oldest name takes priority. Well, Homo was the oldest name, so if it belongs to the human genus, it has to be called Homo. And then the oldest name other than that was Pithecanthropus erectus from Eugene Dubois in 1891. So Pithecanthropus is out because it belongs to Homo, but erectus is the oldest species level name. So it becomes Homo erectus. So Pithecanthropus pekinensis didn't exist. It was Sinanthropus pekinensis. Later, they also talk about Sinanthropus. And yeah, so none of those names, all those names are real names, but they've jumbled them up and used them in a way that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Am I correct? Do you guys?
Yeah,
Yes.
I agree.
And she said Paranthropus erectus, which is mixing up two names as well. So there is Paranthropus is a genus, but not Homo. It's not a Homo. It's a similar to an Australopithecine, but more robust.
Yeah, so Pithecanthropus erectus gramensis is the name that she gave to the tropes, which is incorrect because Paranthropus is, like you said, an extinct relative of Australopithecus from Africa. But Paranthropus is identified by huge jaws and teeth, and the tropes don't have huge jaws and teeth. So they're clearly not Paranthropus, so that's the wrong classification. Also, erectus is the species level name. They don't really seem to be erect. Erectus in the name Homo erectus refers to its upright posture, which is the same as our modern upright posture. They clearly don't have upright posture, so I don't know why she called them erectus. And then gramensis is the subspecies level name, which Ross, you already pointed out, you don't name things after yourself. Yeah. I don't know, is it you're not allowed to, or is just really bad form?
Just tacky.
Yeah.
I think it is in the rules. I'm not 100% sure. It is very bad form, but I think it's also in the rules as well. You're not allowed to name after yourself. Plus also, you wouldn't name a subspecies based on just, one population that you found. I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. You need to have two different subspecies before it's worth naming a subspecies. Otherwise, it would just be Paranthropus erectus erectus, probably, right?
Yeah.
When she was given the fake fossils, she was like, "This is just a," and she said that the fake name, and she was like, "I'm from Pleistocene China," and like tossed it aside. Like she was like, "That's not interesting at all." And you're like, "That would be fascinating."
Yeah. What on earth is that doing in Papua New Guinea?
Yeah.
And where on earth did Burt Reynolds get this? I mean, how on earth has he got hold of Pleistocene human fossils in the middle of nowhere in Papua New Guinea?
They seem to be real. She doesn't say like these are fake. She's like, these are real fossils of Pithecanthropus pekinensis. If we say Sinanthropus pekinensis, that's what she meant. It is correct that they would be from mid-Pleistocene China. That is actually where Sinanthropus pekinensis was discovered, the Zhukudian fossils. So I guess that's the one thing they got right.
Yeah, but there's also not much. So like, if you find even just another fossil from China from the Pleistocene, that's not like disinteresting. That's fascinating and very important. Like we don't have a nature big enough.
Maybe Krebs had them. Maybe he, when he'd been an anthropologist,
he was an anthropologist of
them.
some sort.
Yeah, he was something of an anthropologist in his own right.
Yeah, before he went into animal husbandry
or airplane mechanics,
or whatever it is, or geology and mining prospecting. He seems to be a bit of everything.
To be fair, I could see my life going in some direction like that. Okay, let's get back to tuberculum geniale. So first of all, every single bone that they show is a modern human. They're measuring all these skulls. They're saying this is a chimpanzee, this is a baboon. They're all modern human skulls. Tuberculum geniale, I looked up because I know it better by the name mental spine, which I think is a cooler name. This is a little lump on the inside of a jawbone where the tongue muscles attach. So it's a real thing. Tuberculum geniale is the Latin name, which I feel like people are moving away from using Latin names and just using English names because it's not necessary to be so pretentious. I don't like using Latin. Feels like I'm trying to be a pretentious scientist. Anyway, it's a real thing, but the bone she handed him was a humerus, which is an upper arm bone. So I don't even know how they got tuberculum geniale for a humerus. Yeah. It feels like they opened an osteology textbook and randomly flipped through the glossary and like, this sounds science-y.
That's probably what they did.
Mm-hmm. But there's science-y words on the humerus.
If you have the textbook, why don't you just read the textbook and know the words?
Yeah.
Just choose one from the humerus, right? Like, that's the glenoid tuberosity.
Yeah, that would make more sense.
Also, they very, very quickly identify this humerus as belonging to Pithecanthropus. Certainly, there are ways to distinguish humeruses from different human taxa, but it's not something you can do at a glance. You'd have to take some pretty precise measurements and come up with some graphs and stuff. Maybe if you were specializing in mid-Pleistocene human humeruses, you might be able to do it from a glance, but you wouldn't be able to be as confident as they are. You know, it's like, oh yeah, this definitely looks like Pithecanthropus. It's like, oh, this is a human bone. Looks old. Let's measure it, see if it's, because I mean, I've certainly done that before where we find a bone and like, is this modern human? Is it Neanderthal? We like measure some things like, oh, that thing looks like it's in a weird spot. And then you put out the paper and you're like, our conclusion is the data is consistent with a Neanderthal designation. It's not, this is definitely a Neanderthal or this is definitely Pithecanthropus.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, when they find the second skull, I think.
The one that's 10 years old?
I can't remember which one. At a certain point, I stopped writing down my own notes and I just started quoting the crazy things they say. Someone says, it does resemble Sinanthropus, and then the other one says, yeah, except it's more Hominian than Sinanthropus. Hominian is not, and as far as I know, has never been a taxonomic designation in anthropology. Hominin or hominid or hominin, these are all above genus level designations, but hominian is not anything. Also, Sinanthropus is a hominin and a hominid and a hominin. So you can't be more hominin than Sinanthropus. What else do they say? They say something else. Oh, at the court trial, they say it's the racist white professor, or the more racist white professor, I guess. Says the anthropoid, a man-like creature perhaps, but quite incorrect to call it a human. Anthropoid is an old designation of primates that we don't really use anymore because we used to divide primates into two groups, anthropoid and prosimian. And we changed these to strepsirrhine and haplorhine, which sounds much more technical. Anthropoid just means monkeys and apes. It's the group that includes monkeys and apes.
Mm-hmm.
So it is quite correct to call a human an anthropoid. It's a little outdated, but it's still a monophyletic group, so we still use it sometimes because it excludes the tarsiers. But no, it is not incorrect to call an anthropoid a human because a human is 100% an anthropoid.
Yep.
Anthropoid just means human-like, so
and
it would be weird.
To use that word doesn't distinguish us from monkeys or apes. Like, that's how we're grouped in. You wouldn't say use it as a distinguishing factor.
Whew. Okay, here's the most accurate scientific scene in this movie, okay? When they first start finding these fossils and they're sort of excited and they're looking through the jungle looking for more fossils, Sybil and Douglas kiss. And they're looking at each other all romantically, and she says, "Oh, Douglas, wouldn't it be marvelous if we found another complete skull?" And then he is like, "Oh yeah, you're interested in skulls and not actually romance." If anybody has ever dated an archaeologist, that's probably their experience, I think.
Yes. But she was never really that into him. Like, the only reason why they slept together in the first place was that he just kept pestering her. Like, she kept saying no, 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 and then he followed her into her tent. And she said, no, no, no. And then eventually, in the way that somebody does, she was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then in the morning, she was like, that was nothing. It meant nothing.
She was just bored, I think.
Yeah.
So that was interesting that they did at least portray her as being in control. Like, she was the one that set the boundaries and that, the next day, like, booted him and said, I'm not interested. That was...
Yeah. What did he say?
Something.
How did he put it? He said something. He's like, "Oh, so I don't get the season pass."
Not if you're going to put it like that. No, definitely not. Jeez.
It was interesting to me just how blatantly racist their idea of human evolution was. Like, there's the white professor who's supposed to be overtly racist. But even Sybil's explanation of human evolution in the court is really blatantly racist, and I was surprised to hear it so blatantly. Like, when she's putting these skulls out on the counter that are all modern human skulls, but she describes them as baboon, chimpanzee, Neanderthal, and then Aborigine, and then she points to the lawyer and says, next in line is you, this white guy, and you're like, oh, you're literally saying that the indigenous people of Papua New Guinea are more primitive than the white lawyer, and that's not supposed to discredit you. That is what you're actually saying science believes at this point. And I don't know, sometimes you read old scientific papers from like the early 20th century and you see this sort of misunderstanding about, not so much a misunderstanding because they know how evolution works, but it's just this bias that keeps creeping in where it's clear that they think white people are somehow more evolved than other people.
Mm-hmm.
It's
usually not, it's not by the 70s, though. Yeah, that's when you're reading papers from like 1910 or 1920, not 1970.
But I mean, it's completely flawed just from the start because she's talking about. She uses the term, what was it? A chain. That it's not evolution; it's the scala natura. That this kind of very long-standing misunderstanding of how species relate to each other, that each one is a step, that you go from a sponge to a coral to a lamprey to a fish to et cetera, that each one connects to the other. And this is a pre-evolutionary idea. This is something that was used before Lamarck and Darwin and Wallace to explain why there are similarities between biological species. But that's not what evolution is like. Evolution is not a ladder. It's not a scale. It's a very kind of prolific tree or a bush, or with intertwining branches and leaves that are spreading off in all sorts of directions. So I mean, it's fairly clear that these guys did not have any kind of competent scientific advisor when they were making the film, because that's being presented as the legitimate modern understanding is would have been wrong even in the 19th century, let alone in the 1970s. But yeah, I mean, it was kind of jaw-dropping, just how overtly wrong and offensively kind of racist it was, and these were supposed to be the good guys, the ones that we're supposed to be rooting for. This is only sort of 10 years before I was born that this film came out, so it doesn't feel like ancient history to me. It may do to you young things, but yeah, it was.
The film also makes light of this man taking advantage of either an animal or like however they're seeing it, but there's definitely a different position of power and maybe a different idea of what's happening, of him having this sexual relationship with her, knocking her up.
Yep.
I thought that consent is an issue when you don't speak the same language, I guess, but that relationship seemed like the most wholesome part of the whole movie to me. They really seemed like they were in love. I was a little surprised when I was pretty surprised when they went there. I thought like it was implied at some point. He kicks the bucket and hits the guy in the head in his tent, and then Topazia comes running out, and then Krebs comes running out after.
Yeah.
With a lump on his head. And they're sort of like, they're like winking at it here, like, haha, wouldn't it be funny if they were having sex? And then they just went right there at the end, and I'm like, wow, I didn't actually think you were going to actually just
they fully
say,
committed.
oh yes, they're having sex.
Yeah.
But I mean, okay, so there's a gray area here since maybe she's not actually human, but I think that our conclusion is that she's at least partly human, and it seemed like a very wholesome relationship to me. She seemed like she really liked him. He seemed like he really liked her. He clearly really liked her and actually cared about her. He wasn't just in it for sex.
Well,
he was devastated when she died.
Like, so they used them as workers and paid them in spam, right? So I think what I didn't like about it is that there seemed to be some kind of reliance on the Americans for food and stuff. So I
didn't see it as wholesome at all.
To me, it got into that. Yeah,
it was definitely the power imbalance was too much. It'd be like historical instances where there are many examples of thinking of examples like with Jefferson and his relationships with his enslaved the people that he had enslaved. And that I don't think anyone would argue that it was a wholesome relationship between Jefferson and the mother of his children, that he ended up siring with them. It was, again, like Josh, I was hugely surprised that they kind of fully committed to exploring this idea. I thought they were just going to kind of hint at it and wink wink and isn't this funny? But I think the implications of it are pretty horrifying. That like Kim says, that these trophies have been exposed to spam and sandwiches and other kind of things that aren't available to them, and put to work, and then essentially used not just as slave labor, but also as taken advantage of in a way that they could never consent to, because they don't speak the language, they don't come from similar cultures. If you think about it as like a kind of a Star Trek scenario, this is a very big violation of the Prime Directive.
Even just the idea that they were eating them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that was also pretty horrific.
So.
Well, that parallels like all of colonialism. Like in Canada, we see the same thing where we have the government actively trying to force out the traditional lifestyles of Indigenous people, and they become dependent on Western foods like flour and all these high calorie foods, and they're forced to not engage in their traditional hunting. They become reliant on the government. They can't pursue their traditional ways, and it leads over past 100 years, that leads to really bad health outcomes for Indigenous communities in Canada. Yeah. But just to be clear, the wholesomeness only applies to the direct relationship between Krebs and Topazia, which precedes any of the enslavement or any of the other thing. They were the first two to meet, and they took a liking to each other immediately. Of course, all the rest is horrific, and it's slavery, and it's colonialism, and it's all of that all over again.
Yeah, no, I can see what you mean by it. I think it was supposed to be sweet. Because when they first met and they were sharing that ham sandwich, she was making fluttery eyes at him. And it's just really not where I thought the movie was going.
No.
No, that's why I hope nobody listened to this episode without watching the movie first, because there's no way to predict where this movie's going. So all the science is wrong. I hope that it was seen as racist even at the time, because it's hard to watch it now. It's absolutely sexist. We didn't even really talk about that, but I was kind of hoping that our hero Burt Reynolds would sort of learn a lesson about treating women better by this headstrong anthropologist. But it turns out he's the good guy all along, and she learns a lesson about not pursuing science so single-mindedly or something. I'm not sure. Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot that's bad with it, but overall, I like this question it's dealing with about how we define human. And I think that using another type of human to address this question is really interesting. I tried to do this in a course I took for my master's once. I was taking a course on human rights in the cross-cultural perspective, and I'm a biological anthropologist and not a cultural anthropologist. So I wanted to ask the question for my research paper, how do we define human when it comes to human rights? Because that's really easy today. Every human alive today is the same kind of human biologically, so we don't really have to ask that question. But I'm interested in animal rights, and I don't eat meat and stuff like this. So I'm interested in can chimpanzees have human rights? Can dolphins have human rights? And I wanted to take a look, using paleoanthropology as an example. How do we define human when it comes to human rights, and what constitutes human, and why is the concept of human rights even a thing? Why are we so special that humans are the only ones that need rights? And the professor said, I don't think that sounds like an important question. You should write about Down syndrome or something like that. And I'm like, I'm dropping this course.
That's not very scholarly for the professor to say.
Yeah. Anyway, it's a question that I'm really interested in, and I feel like I don't see people talking about it quite as much, and maybe it's just not that interesting. Maybe I'm just weird, but I love looking...
touch on it, though. A lot of the movies we watch touch on it. Like Planet of the Apes and Charlie, the one with Charlie. Yeah. And...
This one really tries to get at it from a legal perspective. Let's pin down what human actually means. Mm-hmm. And I guess none of them can answer it, because it's not a question that can actually be answered, because human is a made-up word that we made up and we decided what it means before we understood how evolution works. And so we just can't reconcile the two, which I guess that's the answer the movie comes to, and that's the only really possible answer, isn't it?
Well, and biology doesn't really have discrete categories, so us trying to have this put these blocks on this discrete category and say what can go in it, what doesn't go in it, is not biologically sound, really, right?
So, what is our final analysis of this movie?
I kind of think it was terrible, but I think anthropologists should watch it.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't want to watch it again. No. I would never watch it again. But I think it would be important.
Be very sad if I had never seen this movie.
Yeah.
Yeah. Terrible, but interesting. I think it's maybe how I would describe it.
Yeah. I would assign it as to write an essay on it, but I'd be really worried about what I'd get back.
Maybe I'll assign this in my pop culture class, which is starting next week.
Yeah.
Oh, God. It was just, it's one of those films where they're obviously trying to do something, but they just don't quite make it. And so if they just had it as a court case drama and had the discovery of the trophies as be a crawl right at the beginning and said, oh, we found a new species of human in...
Someone had sex with it and now this court case has happened.
Exactly. and had that as the kind of prologue, and then had the whole thing as a court case, then that might have been more sensible, I guess. It would have been, they'd have been able to say possibly more of what it was they were trying to say. But to do...
I mean, they shoved the most interesting part into the last 20 minutes of the movie.
Yeah. And it's just, it's like soap opera levels of oh my God, just what? Do you have to rewind and find out what actually just happened there? Oh, so they've shown that they brought the skulls back to the West and shown them to the press, and then now they've set up a mine and they're using them as slave labor. Okay. Oh, now one of them's pregnant and Krebs is the father. Right. Oh, and now she's about to give birth. Okay. Oh, and now Burt Reynolds has killed the baby. Right. Okay. And now there's going to be a trial. What? There's only so much you can cope with before you find yourself doing mental gymnastics just trying to keep up.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it was intense. It was intense.
If you've been enjoying Screens of the Stone Age, get in touch with us. Follow us on Twitter at SOTSA_podcast and on Facebook at SOTSA podcast, or send us an email to screensofthestoneage@gmail.com. Screens of the Stone Age is supported by the Paleoanthropological Society of Canada. Find out more at pasc-scpa.ca.
Okay, I need to take drugs to go lay down.